Good morning, everyone. This is Warwick Lace from NWR Communications. We'll start the call now. Thank you all for your time today on the investor call for Structural Monitoring Systems. The intention today is obviously to discuss the recent announcement with Delta Airlines. So I'll just talk you through proceedings, and then I'll hand over to Toby Chandler to give you an overview. So after Toby's overview of the announcement, which will cover off some of the more sort of salient points, we'll go through some pre-submitted questions. So thanks to all of those who have already sent those through. A number of very specific and good questions that we'll like to provide some color around. And then we will also be taking questions during the call. If any other questions want to be submitted, please submit that to me. My contact details, my email address was on the invite. So yeah, and then we'll address any questions that come through that hadn't been addressed yet. So really over to Toby. Toby, could you introduce just the rest of the team that are on the line as well, and then provide us with an overview?
Sure. Thanks, Warwick, and everyone, thanks for joining the call. I'm on the line. Mike Reveley, Executive Director and CFO, is on the line. Andy Chilcott, Non-Executive Director of the company, is on the line. Sam Wright, Company Secretary, and Trevor Lynch Staunton, who is our Head of Technology at AEM, who's responsible for overseeing all of our manufacturing, engineering, quality control, etc. So obviously, a fairly pivotal time for the company. I think that would be an understatement, and I think that clearly the magnitude and the scale of this agreement was lost a little bit in the announcement, and I'll just start with that. We had several drafts of this announcement that were going around, and like any announcement, there is an approval process that relates not only to what we would like to say, but what we're able to say based on the relationship that we have with Delta. And so the ultimate announcement was somewhat more abridged and scaled back than the one that we had legally and company approved. The reason for that is that there are sensitivities. Delta is an extraordinarily powerful player in the aviation space, and there were simply things that they weren't comfortable with being said in a publicly disseminated format. And so what we will try and do on this call, one of the main reasons for this call, is to provide an elaboration where we can with some of the key terms in the announcement. Prefacing that, I'm sure all of you know who Delta are and you've Googled them. They are the second largest fleet operator in the world. The only reason that American Airlines is larger than Delta now is because of American's recent merger with US. Delta operates probably and almost certainly the most diverse civil aviation fleet in the world. They operate aircraft which, again, arguably have the greatest age range of any operator. They are known for operating very, very large, old aircraft and really milking those aircraft for as much as they can in terms of useful life, and that's evidenced by their continued use of aircraft like the MD-88s and MD-90s. They are the largest airline in the world by value and market cap, and an extremely powerful counterparty for any OEM in terms of Delta's ability to influence and guide the way OEMs are building and delivering aircraft. And for us, we could not think of a more, powerful and appropriate partner to have as we now look to formatively roll this technology out into the civil aviation arena. Just focusing on a number of key points and just broadly speaking first, this is very much a company-making announcement and agreement that we've struck. We have a technology which is unique. It has been validated over many, many years. It provides a function which engenders massive value opportunities for all operators of aircraft in the world. This discussion will focus very much on civil aviation. We will touch on some of our other programs at the completion of the call. But just within the civilian aviation sector, and given the way that that sector operates, this is something that has game-changing potential for a number of reasons. And Delta, 4 to 5 years ago, when we re-established communications with Delta, when we effectively initiated the program that we completed at the end of 2015, which was sanctioned by the FAA and by Boeing. And as we've moved from that program to where we are today, there has been a very, very clear alignment of beliefs with Delta and ourselves as to what this technology would also ultimately be able to provide to the aviation sector as a significant alternative to the way aircraft are inspected and maintained. Looking at, again, the background here, you know, we were a company 5 years ago, and this needs to be, I think, reiterated. You know, we were a 4 to 5 million market cap company that was struggling. The business model was completely incorrect. The survivability of the company was virtually, well, highly uncertain. It's taken, you know, some amount of time to effectively right the ship, and then once that ship was righted, one of the key decisions there was to create the relationship we had with AEM to dramatically improve our technology translation from a theoretical technology into a commercial platform, the ability to produce equipment that was world-class, that was effectively going to be able to be used in civilian aviation. These are all very, very key decisions, in addition to dramatically controlling the capital structure of the company. And while there's obviously been a lot of frustration in terms of how long things have taken longer than I certainly expected, certainly a lot longer than we envisaged. That's the nature of aviation. There are a number of things we can't control, but I think it's very important to realize that during these periods where things took longer, you know, we haven't diluted the capital structure, we haven't issued shares. You know, everyone that owned a certain number of shares in this company 2 or 3 years ago, and a certain percentage of that company still owns the same percentage of that company today. And I think that's a very, very important thing to realize, and it's an important thing to remember that you know, we're not forcing shareholders to consistently top up and buy stock in order to maintain their holding percentage of the company, and that's something that we've been very, very strict in performing as we move forward. Looking at this agreement now, there are several terms, and we've had several questions which we'll address. But one of the things that did cause some confusion was the reference to the 6 to 7 million spend, and also the distinction between equipment sales and global licensing. One of the things of this agreement that is absolutely critical is that this is an agreement that has effectively been extensively negotiated and effectively commercially ordained by Delta. Delta would not have signed this agreement if they didn't believe that the commercial reality exhibited by every part of the agreement was effectively realizable and executable in the global aerospace arena. So as a company, we've always enjoyed a couple of major points. One is that we've had extreme leverage, meaning that we can manufacture equipment for a very, very low cost, very, very low labor and CapEx requirement. And the cost of that equipment for us from a manufacturing standpoint, we're always so low that given our focus on developing a global service agreement / royalty type model, as a company, you know, we were prepared potentially to give the equipment away based on the fact that the revenue potential on the licensing deals, etc., is so great. However, with this agreement, we have now established a global catalog. We have a global catalog which will be effectively made available to all airlines on a confidential basis as they choose to transact with us. Delta will be receiving a discount on all of the equipment that they buy from us. But what's important to recognize is with the establishment of this global catalog, we've effectively locked in commercially the ability to sell equipment at significant margins. I'll just say that those margins are very significant indeed. On top of that, we have a secondary model which is inexorably linked to the equipment sale model, where we will be entering into service agreements with all companies that transact with us and effectively purchase sensors for installation on the aircraft. There will be a requirement to purchase both sensors and peripheral equipment, and there will also be a requirement to effectively pay us for the right to use our technology over effectively perpetual years. The equipment is designed to last the life of the equipment. It is designed to be installed for the life of the equipment, meaning the aircraft, and therefore we expect to be paid for the right to use the technology, which creates massive cost and revenue opportunities for these operators who use the equipment. Delta, with the $6 to $7 million, effectively has the ability as our partner through this agreement to share in the global revenue platform that we create. What it means is that Delta will receive commissions based on the equipment sales that we have with all Delta competitors, both North American and global. And Delta will also receive commissions based on the service agreements that we enter into. And as we said in the announcement, the way those service agreements will work is that they will scale from somewhere between $0.5 and $1.5 million in year one, based on depending whether you're dealing with a tier 1, 2, or 3 operator. To give you an example of a tier 1, tier 1 is someone like a Delta Airlines, obviously, or a United or an American. A tier 2 would be someone along the lines of an Alitalia or a Virgin Australia, and a tier 3 would be everyone else. So we're talking regional players like AirTrans in the US, smaller carriers in Europe, etc., would encapsulate tier 3. As we move forward, we will more formatively define those tiers, but the business model from day one is going to very much target the tier 1 operators with the very large fleets, and everyone on this call can probably name 20 carriers in the world right now who almost all of them would certainly be tier 1s because they're essentially household names. The Delta to receive the commissions, they have to reach the minimum spend threshold, and that spend threshold is exhibited by that number, and that number effectively encapsulates spend on equipment that Delta will need to effectively realize, and that spend is based on a number of sensors. The number of sensors we can't divulge because the sensors will effectively provide potentially proprietary information, which Delta doesn't want its competitors knowing about. But to put it in perspective, a single application on just 2 aircraft types in the Delta fleet would effectively move through that minimum spend pretty quickly, and we would envisage that minimum amount being achieved quite quickly. How do we know that? Well, firstly, we've gone through a 4-year program to get here. We know for a fact that Delta has multiple applications right now that are already being moved through the system for approval. And on top of that, Delta has already allocated budget for this program, not just in 2017 and 2018, but beyond. So we expect Delta to begin quickly and pretty rapidly moving this equipment into their fleets and effectively gaining the benefits of the technology. Mentioning Delta Finance, etc., and again, given the time involved in this, just so everyone understands the process, is that we were dealing with 6, 7, 8 different areas of Delta to get this done. Business units, supply chain, finance, tech ops, legal. All of these areas had to effectively sign off, not just on the agreement in terms of the functionality and the parameters of the agreement, but they also had to sign off on the spend, the budget, etc. So this has been a very, very heavily vetted agreement. And again, that level of vetting and that level of commitment that Delta has shown through this process and effectively negotiation, which, as we all know, has gone, several months longer than we expected, means that we have not only an agreement which has been heavily vetted, it's one that is effectively, as I said earlier, being ordained as a commercial model which they believe is going to have very, very real traction in the world. As we move forward with Delta, the other very critical thing to mention, and again, something that took longer than we expected a couple of years ago, and we've mentioned this in the agreement, This is not going to be a situation where applications on Delta aircraft are approved such that Delta effectively owns those applications, which would be the case if we had a situation where supplementary type certificates, or STCs, were the approval that was gained. 2 years ago, we made a decision with Delta, which effectively extended the time that we were expecting to see relative to the approval of our in-flight program back in 2015. And the reason for that was that we are aligning with Delta such that all of the approvals that are gained are either going to be in the form of service bulletin revisions or in the form of effectively AMOCs, or global AMOCs, global alternative means of compliance. So with respect to a service bulletin issued by an OEM like Boeing, we will have effectively a revision which is global, which means anyone operating that aircraft can effectively use the technology. In the event of an airworthiness directive issued by a regulator like the FAA or EASA in Europe, we will effectively have a global AMOC, which means that, again, any operator in the world can use this technology. So every single application that goes through the Delta system and is approved, we are going to have immediate global approval for those applications. Again, that is very, very important. And one of the things that we wanted to mention in the announcement to give you some idea of the scale of this, I'm not going to give you specifics, but given the minimum spend threshold that Delta has, and given the number of aircraft in their fleet, and given the likely number of sensors that we typically see for a single application, in the event that the Delta fleet would have just one application in using sensors and peripheral equipment, the guide is that you would see a revenue result which would be multiples of what we've talked about as a minimum threshold. So while we're obviously happy with that threshold, and we understand that this creates a very, very important initiation to a global commercial model, we're obviously aware that with the number of applications that we expect to come through Delta, and then the fact that the entire world is going to have the ability to use those applications, we're talking about a significantly large revenue model with a counterparty who is commercially aligned and commercially rewarded to see this technology as quickly and as holistically used by the entire global aerospace industry. And again, the commissions that we are going to be paying Delta, both on the annual technology licensing agreements and the sale of equipment to other operators, in totality will be quite meaningful once we have multiple counterparties. But as a company, it's a payment that we would happily make every day. And frankly, given the scale of the revenues that we'll realize, it will be a very, very small amount. I'm not going to say it's immaterial, but certainly I think we came out of this with an agreement that we were certainly much, much happier with coming out than what we thought we would effectively obtain when these negotiations started. So I think two other points to talk about in the announcement, and this will probably relate to some questions that come through later. Delta is specifically not paying an annual licensing fee. Delta will simply be buying equipment from us, and that equipment business, point of sale business for our equipment, will result in millions of dollars of revenue, as I said, on very, very favorable gross margin characteristics. But having Delta as a counterparty, we use the term, inverted commas, lead. Delta, by simple virtue of their position in the global aerospace industry, and by virtue of the fact that they will be using a technology which absolutely circumvents the manner in which aircraft are routinely inspected today, which is grounding, dismantling, visual or some form of aided inspection technique, reassembling the aircraft, and then the aircraft effectively flying off again. In many instances, we're talking tens to hundreds of hours to perform these inspections. By virtue of the fact that Delta is using a technology which allows them to circumvent that legacy basis for inspection, it's a massive calling card. And we are absolutely convinced, as is Delta, once they begin to use the technology, I think global take-up will be rapid. It will start in earnest and then gain a lot of momentum. And as that momentum is gained, our revenue model has an extraordinarily scalable component to it, which will be realized not just in very, very large initial point of sale business for the company, but then a perpetual and recurring revenue stream, which will continue to grow each year until we peak at that level that we mentioned in the release, where we expect all service agreements to be peaking in that 10 to 15 million US dollar range per year. So hopefully I've clarified a number of things there. Warwick is going to read through some of the questions, and I think, again, these questions that have been posed by a number of shareholders will shed more light. And again, with respect to the questions, we'll be as specific as we can. Some of the questions are going to relate directly to the program, but some of the questions relate to other areas or related areas of business, and we'll try and answer them to the greatest extent possible. Thank you. Back to you, Warwick.
Thanks, Toby. We'll just rip straight into it. There've been a number of questions asking regarding the time frame taken to bed down further agreements. A recognition that getting the Delta one across the line incredibly important, but obviously took a lot of time and negotiation. What's your feel for further contracts and the time that those might take to be bedded down?
Yeah, I'm just going to, so with these questions, I'll effectively pass them down to the other guys on the call, but I'll probably have Trevor jump in because he can talk about what's involved with each approval process. I think it's critical to know that given the in-flight program that we had over many quarters, we effectively have an explicit approval from both Boeing and the FAA that the equipment is safe to be used in a civilian aircraft environment. And the important critical testing with respect to any application is going to come in the form of extensive laboratory testing, probability of detection curves, etc. Trevor can talk more about that. But the most we can say on that is that we have absolute knowledge that Delta has multiple applications that are currently in their system that will be approved and will use the technology. We have budget from Delta formally allocated from Delta's finance division that has been allocated to spend for this year and next year and beyond. Based on those parameters alone, we know that there is, and obviously for months and months of negotiation and interaction with our counterparty, Delta, we know that there is a very, very strong commitment to use this and to move forward quickly and aggressively to realize the commercial benefits. As far as take-up from the rest of the industry, we don't know the answer to that definitively, but what we do know is that the aviation industry, it's a narrowly defined business. There are 4 key OEMs in the world. There are, obviously more key operators, but it's an inherently very small market. And again, we believe, and Delta believes very, very clearly, that once there is definitive and escalating use of this technology through Delta, and Delta having the ability to operate this to their complete fleet customers, and there are multiple fleets that Delta provides different maintenance services to, we believe that the take-up is going to be fairly succinct initially, and it will grow significantly once we have several critical players globally using the tech. Trevor, do you just want to talk about the way you see the approvals moving forward on an application-by-application basis and what's involved as we have each technology approved for each new application?
For sure, yeah. So with the existing approval that we had with it's taken years, where we have a measurement of performance called the probability of detection that we use for the sensors. And this defines how well they're working, right? So it's a performance measurement, and we use, and we did a whole bunch of environmental testing, durability of the sensors themselves, and did that testing with some very extreme profiles, far enough that they would cover any foreseeable environmental conditions you'd see on commercial aircraft, leveraging existing technology and procedures that we had through all sorts of products we've done with avionics over many years, 20 plus years of experience doing environmental and performance testing. So this was all compiled. We have all that data, and so with that large amount of data, we would be able to do a compliance mostly by similarity to that existing approval. So there's a big stack of paper, and we may be having to replace, less than 10% of it with a new application. It's going to vary on each application. If they're similar in their inside the regular fuselage, like we were with the Delta application, well, this will be fairly straightforward. We'd be cut and dry within a number of weeks to push the data package forward to the regulatory body for approval. If it's a little more complex, perhaps in an area that we hadn't done previously or don't have approval, it's going to stretch out maybe into a few months. So if approvals and aviation are difficult tasks. Not everybody can get them, but we've been doing it for a very long time, and we seem to have a process down that makes it work. And the work that Dennis Roach and crew did at Sandia and did all the environmental testing and brought that data for us was very beneficial for that, of course. That was key.
I think Mike Reveley here as well. I think just the work that we've been doing over the years with the various OEMs has a big impact in terms of how quickly we can turn these around. With Boeing, they've already rewritten service bulletins, so to rewrite another or a series of service bulletins on Boeing aircraft, it becomes not quite a cut and paste, but the hard work has been done, right? So for the people down in Embraer, I would say they're absolutely in the same situation. In fact, they're probably well ahead of even Boeing in terms of where they are of identifying applications and rewriting service bulletins to address those applications. And then with EASA, what we're obviously part of this program is to work with Delta to identify an Airbus aircraft and either work on a service bulletin or an AD related to the aircraft and then move it through the system. So of the three OEMs, Airbus is probably, I wouldn't say farther behind, but they haven't done this. They haven't rewritten a service bulletin. But in our communications with them in a recent trip to Dubai, these guys meaning Airbus, are really looking and yearning for that first application. They are waiting for Delta and the representatives within Delta, since Airbus has representatives at Delta, to move that through the Airbus chain. So they're very incentivized to make this happen as well. So I think we're in a position, certainly with respect to service bulletins, to have a very quick approval process within the OEMs. And once we get those service bulletins rewritten, we're in a position effectively to use those as our inventory to go out to the Americans, the Uniteds, and the Southwest, so virtually every operator on the planet with those applications in our marketing quiver. So things can happen very, very quickly post these initial series of applications that we're working with on Delta to get approved. And then if we have to work with the regulators, that the FAA is already very familiar with it. We've brought the center wing box section to them. they've been following us for years, and Dennis and SMM, Dennis Roach at Sandia Labs and SMM have been working closely with them to keep them as in the loop and part of the approval process. So we think we've got the FAA pretty taken care of in terms of their knowledge and experience with CDM. ANAC, completely same story with them. Dennis Roach and Abrea have been leading the charge with ANAC down in Brazil. Very comfortable that they can turn around things very quickly once applications are submitted to them and if they're needed for approval. And then, as we said, Airbus would really like to get something in front of EASA as well for their approval. And as people really know, the regulators are very much, it's not a client state, but the people that know these aircrafts are the OEM. So the OEM is comfortable with the technology. They'll make sure that the regulators are also familiar and comfortable with the technology. So a lot of work has been done to get us to this point, and therefore that next click for industry adoption is really just what we're doing right now in the groundwork with Delta to get multiple applications identified and begin that process of rewriting the service bulletins.
Just quickly adding something before we move to the next question, a couple of questions have come through. Just to clarify, when we talk about approvals, the approval comes from two areas. It only comes from the OEM or it comes from the regulator. If you have a service bulletin that's independently a service bulletin, so it's effectively it's a bulletin that goes out which effectively stipulates that a certain area of the aircraft which is problematic or has effectively an additional inspection requirement for either the potential to be problematic or there's been issues where we've all seen globally, issues with cracking, or we've seen issues with aircraft where certain areas of the aircraft are prone to certain structural fatigue. In those instances, you'll almost certainly have a service bulletin and/or an airworthiness directive issued by a regulator. Just because it's a service bulletin, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is automatically an airworthiness directive. Sometimes the regulator will effectively deem that service bulletin is enough, but if they think that the area is particularly onerous, they'll slap an AD on it also, and that effectively, in some ways, validates the importance of the inspection related to that area of the aircraft. So, it's a more sensitive structural or fatigue issue that we're dealing with. So, with those approvals, because they are governed by specific service bulletins or airworthiness directives, it's important to know that the approvals come from an OEM, like Boeing, a regulator, like the FAA, that they will deal with a specific aircraft type and a specific aircraft area on that aircraft type. And so the suite of applications that you build is driven by these broad-based approvals to use the technology, but it is a suite of, if you like, micro or bottom-up approvals, which will relate to specific aircraft types and specific applications. And so over time, you'll see CVM being approved on multiple aircraft with multiple applications on those aircraft, but the people or the bodies issuing those approvals will either be a regulator or an OEM. Sorry.
Thanks, Toby. So just a clarifying question around the applications. You currently have approval for one application on one aircraft type, 737?
At the moment, yes. And what this agreement will do is build that out to multiple applications, multiple aircraft types. I think what's important to note is that this is not a situation where Delta effectively wags the tail, so to speak. 6 to 9 months down the road, we absolutely expect that a Southwest or an American could approach us directly with their own fleet and have a specific application that's governed by a service bulletin. But it's almost certainly going to be governed by a service bulletin or an airworthiness directive. They could come to us and effectively we would work through an approval process with Southwest, with American, with United, with British Airways. It doesn't matter. Ultimately, the process will be the same. The approval will be global. And Delta, paradoxically, will have the ability to then use that application, if they wanted to, in their own fleet. There will be certain aircraft that are not used by every fleet. So if we have, for example, an application on a 777, that's not going to be applicable to, obviously, an operator that doesn't fly 777. Delta, for example, has 757. Not every operator in the world uses 757. So over time, when the value proposition of CVM is fully realized and it's truly global in terms of its commercial impact, we expect to be working with multiple operators and OEMs where we'll be in parallel working on different programs, designing sensors for those programs, having those applications approved, and then ultimately manufacturing the sensors, delivering the equipment, and effectively having those sensors installed. So, this is a long-term agreement, but another critical component of it, which I didn't mention earlier, is that this is a non-exclusive agreement. We can go out and do anything we want to do with any other operator. Delta would actually be happy for us to do that because effectively it gives them potentially an additional application, but it also gives them a revenue stream, and both on what we end up doing in terms of equipment sales, but also in terms of annual licensing agreements that we strike with competitors.
Thanks, Toby. There just a couple more clarifying questions. There seems to be a lot of interest and also confusion around some of the points here. Is there a sort of a sequential process that you work through? Do you go from OEM to regulator to airline, or do things run in parallel, the approval process?
Okay, so I'll talk about this and then probably Andy can have some comments. So firstly, just briefly, the approval process, certainly the model with Delta, I think the critical thing to realize with respect to inspections is that the entire cost of an inspection that is effectively mandated as compulsory by a regulator and or an OEM is borne by an operator. And we've talked in the past about the cost of those inspections. It's the time on the ground, the man hours, the very, very long labour requirement that's often associated with these inspections. But the biggest loss of revenue is clearly the inability to utilise the aircraft. And the last thing any operator wants is an aircraft that's grounded, not earning revenue. And it's what's even worse about the current inspection methodologies is that you don't have a condition-based system for inspection, which means when you inspect, in the overwhelming majority of cases, you don't actually find anything. And so effectively you've grounded, inspected, and put back together a perfectly good aircraft in the case of onerous inspections, which never needed inspection anyway because there was nothing wrong with the area that was inspected. So a big part of this business is going to be exactly what we're doing with Delta. It will be operators looking to dramatically decrease the cost burden of aircraft ownership and significantly increase the revenue potential for these aircraft by keeping them flying. As time continues, it is likely that we will see OEMs looking to potentially incorporate sensors into their aircraft, not even necessarily areas that are governed by airworthiness directives or service bulletins. They may just be areas of the aircraft that, even for brand new aircraft, such as the A350, the 777X, these are all new aircraft where the OEMs have the potential for maintenance issues. There could be areas of the aircraft which may be prone to structural issues going forward. So from the outset, they want to monitor those at an early stage from a, simply from a monitoring perspective, but also to lessen the burden on operators who potentially may have a problem with certain areas. And so one of the natural evolutions of this is potentially the use of OEMs at point of manufacture. And again, that would be a a very separate revenue stream to the one that's being established with Delta and all of the other operators who fly globally. Andy, do you want to have some comment on that?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I fully agree with those comments. In terms of the process going forward that we would undertake, I think Trevor touched on it earlier, it won't be nearly as onerous. We literally have dragged data from, from our work, from Sandia's work, from input from airlines, to the FAA office, the FAA, to Boeing, to everyone. And that process, which has taken years, has basically brought everyone to the conclusion that this is a safe operational system that has potential to do onerous inspections that everyone now recognizes 99 times out of 100 end up in no crack found. So our process now, having been through all of that, is relatively simple and is actually driven by the operator. Now, Delta is way more than just an operator. It has a huge maintenance facility and engineering facility and has very strong contacts and credibility both with the OEM and with the FAA. So essentially what happens now is we are more hands-off and we let that process happen. As they discover parts of the aircraft that they would like, and they already have a list of them, parts of the various aircraft that they'd like to inspect, and they've done the business model, they can now run through those processes very quickly, and only by exception do we need to step out of a very slick process and do a little bit of extra work, but with the full understanding from the FAA that this is a fail-safe process, with a full understanding from Boeing as to how it works and how to enter it into a service bulletin, and with an increasing level of understanding from the airlines as to how much time it saves and how to actually use it. So from now on, we can, having sort of hand lugged this up the hill, we can now be slightly hands-off and let the system work. And that was the beauty in going these extra couple of years and getting Delta to get fully engaged and fully across a wider approval. So it doesn't mean we won't be doing anything, but our involvement will be a lighter touch, and will be just, with those things that come in by exception, that are not run-of-the-mill applications, we'll obviously get involved in on a business case basis. But essentially, the processes will be more driven now by the operators than by us, and less, with a more certainty of a quick outcome.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks for that. There are a couple of questions around the licensing agreements. Could you provide any color around the licensing agreements and also the different operating margins you expect between licensing agreements and equipment sales?
Yeah, I'll just start with that, and there's actually a question from Todd, which sort of ties into that a little bit as well, which I'll address. So licensing agreements, effectively, and this is a question that was asked that relates to that. This agreement with Delta has taken months. That's because it's really the first of its kind, and there are a lot of moving parts that go beyond just effectively selling equipment to Delta and giving them and having an annual licensing agreement that they pay us. We end up with an agreement which is a lot broader than that. There will be the ability to project our relationship with Delta, to use the Delta branding in certain circumstances where SMS technology and Delta can coexist. So there are a lot of moving parts which required quite a lot of legal input. So it was a lengthy agreement. Going forward, when we talk about an agreement with an operator, it's pretty simple. We have a suite. Either the applications are already approved and they're there, and an operator wants to effectively use the technology. And again, what does that mean? It means that a regulator or an OEM has specifically mandated and approved the use of CVM as an alternative to inspecting an aircraft. So if you're an operator commercially, you can effectively, while the plane is at the gate, plug in our PM200 diagnostic interface, obtain the necessary data that you need to from the sensors that are installed, and then effectively compute the outcome of that data acquisition to determine whether or not there's a fault with the aircraft. Or your alternative is to put the aircraft in the hangar, dismantle it, inspect visually or via some electronic or related aid, reassemble the aircraft, and then send the aircraft on its way again. I think the prognosis for the opportunity set there is pretty clear, that any commercial reality is going to use CVM when CVM is absolutely approved. So we have an approved application and an airline wants to effectively use that technology. We don't have to do any other proving. It's done. The technology is already approved. It's simply generating a purchase order, providing the sensors, providing, if necessary, training, providing installation training. And again, I'll let Trevor just maybe talk about what installation preparation essentially involves. But what we're essentially doing is when you have an area of the aircraft that's accessed, it's cleaning the area, applying the sensors a bit like a Band-Aid, and effectively closing the aircraft back up when the aircraft was in for that specific inspection anyway. So it's not a difficult process installing these sensors with pretty minimal training. So we have a point of sale revenue that's immediately realized. And that point of sale revenue is occurring with product which we have, as we said in the announcement, extremely high operating margins. On top of that, the right to use the technology ongoing, you've effectively installed a technology which is there to be used for the life of the aircraft, and in fact we're providing that operator the ability to use and license, we're providing a license to use our technology holistically across their entire fleet and effectively in perpetuity. So the nature of the agreement, as we said, will start between $0.5 to $1.5 million in year one, and over time, meaning peaking in years 6, 7, you'll be at that threshold that we indicated in the announcement. And at that point, that threshold in terms of a ramping up from that initial mean point of $1 million, and then stepping up from there to a significantly higher number, fully realizes that an airline over time will use the technology for more and more applications. And when you actually look at the commercial reality of what the technology provides in terms of a significant commercial advantage to the current inspection process and the ability to not only avoid that, but also to actually be able to fly the aircraft, so it's earning revenue, the checks that will be written at that point are just so small that no operator in the world is going to have issues with that when over a 6 to 7 year period, the technology is being broadly applied and the benefits of that technology are being realized across a tier 1, tier 2 fleet. Frankly, there'll be checks that don't even matter. They're so small relative to the commercial reality that you will gain being able to bypass inspections on aircraft. And look, there are other things that this technology can provide. Life extension programs for aircraft. It enables operators to fly aircraft longer by delaying the onset of what typically would be shorter inspection period intervals or more arduous inspections as aircraft age. These are all things that the use of CVM equipment can delay. And so when you purchase a new aircraft, your inspection cost is relatively low because the aircraft is brand new. But the cost of the aircraft is high because you either lease the aircraft and you have a significant component to actually own the aircraft, or you buy the aircraft and you depreciate it. These are big costs. Once the aircraft reaches a particular point, your ownership cost of the aircraft declines, but your maintenance cost goes up significantly. So when the honeymoon period sort of begins from your ownership standpoint, you're faced with shortening inspection intervals and more arduous inspections. The technology has the ability to effectively significantly impact what's going to happen with aircraft fleets as they age, and it will provide a very real basis for operators to significantly extend the life of their fleets. And for carriers like JetBlue, EasyJet, Southwest, these are operators that effectively operate, workhorse aircraft, A320, 737, which fly 2-hour, 4-hour flights. And as a passenger, whether the aircraft is a year old or 15 years old, it doesn't really matter because the interiors, etc., are the same. The experience doesn't change. But the advantage to the operator being able to own and operate an older aircraft, supplemented by CVM, is very, very real. Trev, do you want to just talk about the installation a little bit more, just so people are aware of what's involved in doing that and the minimal training, etc., required?
Sure, sounds good. So it is, you liken it to a Band-Aid, and it is something like that. So I look at it more as a really nice sticker application where the surface preparation is nice. We'd go in, we'd clean it off, wipe it down, alcohol wipe, let that dry. We then do a deionized water wipe down to make sure that's clean. Sand it very lightly with lighter than 600 grit sandpaper, or 600 depending on the application, and just enough to scuff up the surface there a bit and make sure we have a good smooth surface on that edge, and then wipe it down one more time and wait. We peel the release liner off the back of the sensor and apply and consolidate it down to the area. So the actual sensor application would be complete at that time. And that training, when we went through with the Delta guys, I think I showed them 2, possibly 3 sensors. I did them myself. And after that, they were on their own and installing sensors on their own. The first 3 aircraft I attended while we were there. And after that, felt confident that they were able to, those techs were able to run it on their own. We've made the tubing installation very simple. They just snap some connectors together to complete the pneumatic tubing circuits and install the connector so that they can go in and interrogate the sensors when they need it, possibly on the ramp.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks for that. Just a couple more questions while we're on the sensors and licensing agreements. In terms of targets, what are you expecting in terms of number of licensing agreements in the next year? And are these licensing agreements calculated? How are they calculated? Is it on airline savings, or if you could just give us some color around how the actual percentage is calculated?
Yeah, I'll start with that, and then Mike can talk about what we're seeing already with Delta and the way we think that sort of pans out. But I think the important thing to remember is that before we even see the licensing agreements scale up, the point of sale revenue from equipment sales is dramatic. It's going to be extremely high. So when you're talking about a fleet-wide application and the number of sensors involved and the amount of equipment, it's a very big number. So that number will effectively be realized with us before we even build the sensors. Effectively, we're paid to make the sensors and then deliver the sensors. And so it's an instantaneous revenue component. The licensing agreement then will start in year 1 as the range we've indicated, which is a central tendency of $1 million per annum, and then grow from there to the peak over several years of 10 to 15 million. And again, this is a model that's effectively being looked at, vetted, and effectively ordained by virtue of our agreement as a model which will have significant traction globally. Again, it's difficult to say how many licensing agreements that we'll have. If you have multiple applications with Delta, several will have a lot more than that. It's really hard to know what the take-up is. What we know is that ultimately the commercial reality is that once Delta is using this, once you have other players coming in, it's essentially a reality that the commercial benefits of CBM relative to the incumbent methods is huge. It's just almost commercially impossible to think that an operator that could be using the technology that is absolutely approved for use by your OEM manufacturer and or your regulator would not be used, given the advantages of using it and given the cost of using it relative to the alternative cost. So it's tough to say, but we would expect certainly several agreements, and we would expect multiple applications in year one approved by Delta, which would lead to multiple agreements on the back of that. Mike, you just might want to comment on a little bit further based on that side.
Part of what we negotiated for here is to make sure that there was a tight timeline for Delta in terms of identifying those applications. We just didn't want this to be something where, we're sitting there months later and Delta's not, progressing quickly on that front. So we put some pretty tight timelines in terms of what Delta needs to do to identify multiple applications across their fleet. And happily, even when we were, before we signed the Delta agreement, we had a series of meetings with engineers within Delta, with Airbus and Boeing representatives within Delta, and Dave Petrowski sort of tasked them to, begin that process. And just within, even inside the meeting, there were several applications that were mentioned as targets. And then since that meeting, David has come back with and affirmed that not only do they have targeted applications on Boeing aircraft, which is, of course, the easy one, given the fact we've already been through that process before, but also on Airbus aircraft as well. So we're looking at, multiple applications even in the first few weeks after signing the contract that Delta is targeting for their fleet. In terms of the importance, just another piece of the puzzle here, we talked a little bit, and I think Andy talked about the importance of Delta Tech Ops and their involvement in this. They're one of the largest MROs or maintenance facilities globally, and the importance of them. Part of this is Delta has a unique relationship with their they call them complete fleet customers. What that effectively means is these are external operators which have said to Delta, look, we're relying on you to maintain the aircraft as if they were Delta aircrafts. So what that does for us is any application that Delta uses for its own fleet becomes an automatic application for these complete fleet clients as well. So it begins the process where effectively Delta, for those people, almost become a marketing agent for us, right? There's that contact immediately for those airlines that wish to pursue sort of holistically everything that Delta is doing on the maintenance side. So in terms of industry adoption, naturally the first one is Delta. The second ones would be their complete fleet customers. And then we move off into the sort of the wider area for any operator globally. Now, as part of this as well, we're dealing with a leader in, certainly one of the leaders, if not the leaders, in global maintenance for aircraft. And as part of that, Dave Petrowski is the center of that sort of universe. Dave's very much central in that world in writing for the FAA, the approval process for this, working with the major OEMs to determine what that adoption cycle looks like and what's required for that. So he's really at the center of this, not only from a regulatory standpoint, but from a OEM standpoint. And because of that, he has, and he's already mentioned to us, he's got people, head of maintenance at several airlines have already contacted him, interested in the program. And this was actually prior to signing the final contract. So this is a very visible relationship that we have with Delta that just got extremely visible. So part of this, as Toby said, we're using Delta not only as our sort of lever for this, but also our hammer, and also as a co-branding sort of opportunity, marketing opportunity for us. So it's a very powerful relationship on multiple levels. So that sort of industry adoption, I think, happens much quicker than would have otherwise with a partner that wouldn't have been a Delta.
Thanks, Mike. Look, there's a few questions that have come through, which I'll quickly address now. We've been criticized in, occasionally in the past, or sometimes more than occasionally, that we don't spend a lot of time marketing the company from a stock price standpoint, from an investor standpoint. We've never been interested in creating value just because you can go out and effectively talk and spruik, I guess. We've been talking about this agreement for a long time, and the agreement has been in the market for a long time, and it's taken a long time to get this agreement done. But the fact that we've got it done is very important, and it completely changes the landscape of what we're doing. I think shareholders will realize how important it is when we actually start having the revenues coming in, and then we have nothing to do with those revenues except pay them out, which is exactly what we'll do. We will have a cost base operating this company, which is almost going to be exactly what it is today. As I said, we have extremely high operating margin, and we have extremely high operating leverage. So we can scale our business up dramatically with very, very minimal impact on our total cost structure. So again, we're a company that's gone out and created a very unique position for ourselves. But I think investors will realize how unique that is when the revenue starts coming in, and then when you actually understand the profile of what that revenue looks like, then it really takes us into a completely different paradigm. And while it's important to market that, which we'll do, nothing will, I think, relay that more than us operating and executing the platform and the opportunity set that we've got. We will spend more time now that we've got this agreement done, getting on the phone individually with shareholders and effectively talking about the story and making that story more and more broadly known, both through direct investor channels, but through PR, etc. But it's important to realize that you can do that, and there are a hell of a lot of companies, and I've been involved as an investor, and and sometimes in a more major way than that with a lot of companies, and a lot of companies talk a pretty big game, but they don't deliver. And while they're talking a big game, they love to dilute, and they love to effectively create an ownership structure which makes it almost impossible to stay with a company long term. What we've done is created a capital structure which is extremely consistent. We've tried to preserve the value enjoyed by all shareholders, but the important thing is that we're delivering as well, and I think that's going to be made very, very clear in the near term and as we move through into the end of this year and into next year. And following on from that, and in terms of where we stand, there's been some questions, as there always is, about the tech and the security we have in terms of our technology being copied, etc. We have a lot of patents. We have multiple patents in multiple jurisdictions, and that matters. But nothing matters more than the validation process and the absolute barriers to entry that this industry has. The amount of validation, the amount of crap that we've had to deal with to get this technology where it is today, to an aircraft certified, fully finalized, almost perfected to the point of zero failure technology, and it wouldn't be approved by the FAA, and it wouldn't be approved by Boeing, and it wouldn't be approved for use by Embraer unless we were at that point. It's extremely difficult to do that, and the patents matter, but frankly, we are now globally known as the technology that is in partnership with Delta, the largest airline in the world, providing this alternative means to the entire aerospace industry. Now, yes, the Chinese or someone else may try and copy it. That's fine. Great. You might be able to use it in China, but you're not going to be able to use it in Europe. You're not going to be able to use it in America. You won't be able to use it in the rest of Asia for airlines that matter, who actually aren't going to use a Chinese knockoff of whatever technology we're producing. So, look, the patents matter, but you've got to understand how difficult it is to get to where we are. And now that we're here, Dennis Roach has been on calls with investors historically. For someone out of left field to develop a technology that uses a completely new method that could potentially compete with us, fine. 7 or 8 years down the road, we'll see where they're at, but we'll be so far advanced commercially by that point, it doesn't matter. I mean, we're essentially almost monopolistic with where we are. And as long as we continue to do what we do, and as long as we scale up as we need to, as the opportunity set presents itself, and scaling up, as I said, means buying some pretty low-cost equipment, some low-cost labor, and just producing more and more sensors, more and more equipment. Remember that we have partners out there like Testir, where we have an executed MOU, where Testir is a company that is moving into the space, providing the sort of servicing, etc., that exactly what we need. Yeah, look, there'll probably be other agreements that we're doing in the near term that are just going to continue to strengthen our position and effectively see us with a platform that can exploit the opportunities. So, a few people have always been concerned about the technology and how rigid our patents are and the position that we have. But rest assured, we're very, very happy where we are now in terms of our presence in the industry.
Right, thanks, Toby. We haven't received any further questions in the last few minutes. I think that feels like a natural place to wrap it up. One or two of the pre-submitted questions just asked very quickly on other applications outside of the airline industry. I'm not sure if you want to just quickly spend a minute or so covering some of that ground, and then we can wrap up the call.
Yeah, I'll just quickly have a couple of things on that, and I think Mike or Andy and Trevor can have some comment. But we've spoken about civilian aerospace today, and we've spoken specifically about an operator model. We have other programs which are moving forward, absolutely. We've spoken about Sikorsky, we've spoken about the Apache program, we've spoken about the OEM programs previously. It's pretty nice that we have 3 of the world's top 4 OEMs essentially wrapped up with this technology in terms of their use of it. So, yeah, I'm sure there's going to be a lot more to say outside of the Delta deal and what we're doing with Delta directly over the coming quarters. Outside of aerospace, the opportunities are endless in a lot of different areas. We've talked about applications we've had before in bridges, in potential applications, pipelines and infrastructure, major machinery, etc. They're all interesting. They're all revenue opportunities for us. I would see them as much longer-term industries. The fact is, if we even remotely crack the aerospace market, the opportunity set is so large and the revenue potential is so great that, I can't even, it's hard for me to envisage where we'd be as a company in terms of value if we can even partially exploit the aerospace market like we intend to. But there are many industries where the technology is relevant. The beauty of aerospace, and this is critical, is that other industries, there's always a use. The use becomes more optional unless you've got a regulator effectively mandating that use. And the beauty of aerospace, particularly in the civil aerospace market, is that you have regulators and you have OEMs that make it extremely burdensome for operators to comply with structural issues. And that's something that a technology like ours can absolutely exploit. Other industries, whether it's infrastructure, pipelines, bridges, you name it, you don't have the regulatory precision in terms of what is required, where, when, and how. You don't have the same absolute requirement to adhere to a set of regulatory protocols. That's why aerospace is so important. It's so attractive for us. And we can use aerospace as a very, very big springboard going forward. And like anything, look, as we grow this business, we will grow our platform and we will ensure that we exploit the opportunity set we have in aerospace in the best possible way that we can. But again, when I think the market understands the revenue potential for the company, any very, very minor increases, relatively speaking, in our cost base is just going to be dwarfed by what we're able to do on the revenue side. So, you guys can see where we've come from. We've had a lot of positive said over the last few quarters. We've had a lot of negative remarks, but we'll just let the company do the talking, and we'll see where we're at. And we've done something that's critical for this company, that changes the entire commercial reality of this company. And I think over time, the investor base is going to realize that, and it'll be realized when we deliver. Mike, Andy, or Trevor, you want to finish up?
Andy here. I have spent a little bit of my time assessing some of those applications, such in other industries. So it's not that we're ignoring them and just got our blinkers on. Here in Perth, industries are expensive equipment, but I think Toby nailed it. It's actually much harder than you'd think to get the business case up and running in a comparable way to aerospace, because of that extreme conservatism and precision of how they detail inspections to be done. It means that aerospace is a tough nut to crack, but it's also ideally suited to the technology we provide. So I think in time, as Toby says, those other ones will come, and we're not ignoring them. We're assessing them, and they're there, sort of in the wings, along with a number of other more adjacent industries that we can pursue, and it will be easier to pursue with this in our pocket going forward.
Just great, thanks for that. I think, sorry, Toby, was there something else?
Yeah, I was just going to say one last thing. I mean, using a company is about increments. You have a capital base, you have an operational base, you have a total overhead, you have a variable overhead. Ultimately, every time you make a decision, it's the ability to assess that incremental decision relative to the operational base, capital base, and the variable and fixed platform you've got. And so if we have an incremental decision to make where we're going to use our capital, our platform to effectively go after a new industry to create a presence there, that industry has to offer more commercial upside than the one that we're already making significant inroads in. But on top of that, each opportunity we have in that industry, it has to be attractive and absolutely visibly attractive, more so than the opportunity we're going to have in aerospace. And so the point is, we can use minimal resources to effectively foster a new agreement with a new operator, which will guarantee millions in revenue, both point of sale and ongoing annual revenue, for very, very little focus and execution, sort of materiality on the part of the company. Or we can go out and effectively go into new markets. As Andy said, we see opportunities in other markets, but it's all about the effective leveraging of your platform with incremental opportunities, and they will provide the greatest return. And so really, from that standpoint, foreseeably, we're going to be in aviation. We're going to be focused on every part of aviation that we can get a foothold in. And then once we crack that nut and we have the revenue component associated with that, then we have the ability to do a hell of a lot. As I said, the intent always is that we pay a huge amount of that revenue out, just because we have a very, very low operating overhead, but we then have the ability to use that revenue where we think we can add additional incremental value. And that's where I think we start looking at potentially at other industries where we can use the scale and the validation we have from the aerospace sector, and we can use that to leverage into other markets. But that's something that's definitely longer term and not something we'll be aggressively pursuing until we really build out the aviation opportunity.
Yeah, just as a final comment to that, we've really talked about mostly fixed wing aviation, but we do have military programs in rotorcraft and also with Sikorsky. Those are on track. The Sikorsky program from Sikorsky's perspective, they wanted to sort of fold in multiple sensor types onto their aircraft. There's two actually, one ours and one other that addresses an entirely different aspect of what they're looking at to monitor within the Sikorsky aircraft. So we passed very quickly through the lab tests that they conducted at Sandia. The other application evidently is sort of stuck there, and they're not making as much progress as quickly as they would have thought or hoped. Once they make a decision whether or not to continue with that other application, if it does ultimately test correctly in terms of the probability of detection for that application, then they'll take it up to Sikorsky management. But what we're looking at and what Sikorsky said is that they'd like to get through with at least us and then get these on what would be one of their major purchasers.
Mike, do you want to preface that other application is not related to CBM?
It's not related to CBM. As I said, it's a totally different application. It's unrelated to what we're doing in terms of metal cracking.
Yeah, so different technology and different application completely. Yep. Okay.
Correct. It's completely independent of what we're doing. So, but we're still essentially tied to them either being approved or not approved and being able to get through the probability, POD curves, et cetera. So once we get that, I mean, Sikorsky basically is the next step for us would be to get these on aircraft and do a flight test with one of their major clients. They've already identified that client. So we're hoping to hear more. We're likely meeting with Sikorsky up at the Stanford conference, and we can get some more visibility in terms of what their follow-up will be. But you may be indeed hearing more about that program on a go-forward basis. And then, of course, we haven't talked much about the military. We do have the Apache program, which is ongoing, and I think given the Delta agreement, there'll be, and Dennis Roach is sort of beginning to push this a little bit more in terms of wanting to penetrate certainly the Air Force, the U.S. Air Force, with both fixed-wing and rotorcraft applications there as well. So in terms of where we'd likely to see penetration first, is probably it's within obviously aerospace, but probably a likely source for us would be the military for uses on fighters and additional rotorcraft there.
Great. Look, I think we could wrap it up there. We will be making a recording of this Q&A available, and just invite and thank everyone for their interest in the company and for their questions. Look forward to updating you, keeping you updated on the company's progress in the next few months. And thanks again to all.
And just to quickly finalize again, thanks to everyone for your participation. We look forward to keeping you apprised of developments as they occur with Delta, but also outside of Delta. And as those developments occur, we will have similar calls to this, and we'll look to get down that way sometime in fourth quarter as well to have one-on-ones and answer questions directly. So thanks for your participation, and look forward to maintaining contact and keeping updated. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.